Hey everybody, it's Mr. White back with part 2 of your equilibrium notes. So if you haven't watched part 1 yet, you know what you need to do. Go back, watch video part 1 about equilibrium before you watch this part. Otherwise, you're going to be a little bit lost. Okay, so we're going to start off with a really important principle of economics, which is the idea that markets move toward equilibrium. Okay, what I mean by this is that surpluses and shortages are temporary in a free market. The market will eventually clear, meaning it'll eventually return to equilibrium. Now, how do we know that? Well, the reason why is another important principle of economics, the idea that people respond to incentives. An incentive is something that can cause a person to act. It could either be positive, like a reward, or it could be negative, like a punishment. And so if a surplus occurs, producers have a strong incentive to lower their price. If a shortage occurs, producers have a strong incentive to raise their price. The reason why is because if you think about it, when you have a bunch of something that you can't sell, like for example, a bunch of Easter candy left over the day after Easter, you want to get that off your shelves as soon as possible because it's going to go bad and you don't want to waste the money that your store had to spend to supply that Easter candy in the first place. So what's going to happen since you have a surplus of Easter candy is you're going to lower the price to get the market back to equilibrium. If you have a shortage and you run out of a product, then what you need to do is you probably need to raise the price. That's going to cool off the demand for your product and allow things to get back into balance again so that you can restock your shelves. Now, there are only two things that can prevent this from happening. The first one is a market failure, which would mean that something is happening to prevent the free exchange of goods and services, like, for example, a monopoly formed, and now there's just one company that controls the supply, and therefore they can charge just about any price they want. That's something that we have more or less gotten rid of through laws over the years. Market failures do still occur, but you know, luckily not as much as they used to. Now, the other thing that could happen is government price controls, and we're going to talk more about that later. Now, to really understand why markets move toward equilibrium, it helps to understand the concepts of producer and consumer surplus and how they contribute to society's overall well-being. Now, producer surplus just means the total benefit gained by producers when they sell a product at the market price. The idea here is that without a market, a producer might have been willing to sell their product at a lower price, but they get to benefit by selling it at the higher market price. And so mathematically, we can express this by saying that producer surplus is equal to what you actually sold the product for, i.e. the market price, minus what you would have been willing to sell it for. So in our candy bar example, let's say that the market price was 75 cents. Maybe you would have been willing to sell your candy bar for 50 cents, but you get to benefit because the market price is actually 75 cents. So 75 cents minus 50 cents is equal to 25 cents. And so that would be your producer surplus for participating in this market for candy bars. Now, graphically, we can show producer surplus on our graph as a triangle, and it's a triangle that's formed by the area below the market price and above the supply curve. So we're going to take a look at that in just a moment. Next up, consumer surplus is the total benefit gained by consumers when they pay the market price. So this is kind of like inverse of what we just talked about. The consumers would have been willing to pay a higher price for their product, but luckily they get to pay a much lower price, the market price, because there's a market. So consumer surplus is what you would have been willing to pay minus the market price, minus what you actually paid. And graphically, we can show it as the triangle created by the area above the price but below the demand curve. Now, producer and consumer surplus come together to create society's total welfare. Society's total welfare just means how much benefit everyone receives from the market. Now, don't get it twisted. This does not mean government assistance programs. We're not talking about like food stamps or welfare in that sense. In this sense, total welfare just means consumer surplus plus producer surplus. You may remember from the circular flow model that households and businesses comprise the majority of the free market. And so, of course, when we talk about society's welfare, we're talking about the welfare that accrues to both households and businesses from the free market. Now, when the market is completely free, society's welfare is maximized, meaning that when there's nobody getting in between producers and consumers, everybody benefits. This is that laissez-faire idea, hands off. The government shouldn't be too involved in this interaction. If the market's not completely free, in other words, if the government starts getting involved, especially if they start trying to set prices or set quantities in the market, society's welfare is reduced and something called deadweight loss is created. Deadweight loss just means the benefit that is not able to be claimed by producers or consumers and is therefore lost to all of society. So when the government gets in between producers and consumers and tries to set prices, deadweight loss is going to be a side effect that's always going to occur. Now we can actually see producer surplus, consumer surplus, society's total welfare, and deadweight loss on our equilibrium graph. So as I said, consumer surplus is the triangle that's created above the equilibrium price and below the market demand curve. So if you use that, 1/2 base times height, that's how you calculate the area of a triangle. If we actually had numbers on this graph, you could actually calculate with some precision the amount of consumer surplus created in this market. The idea here is that there are some consumers in this market, obviously not all consumers, but some consumers that would have been willing to pay this high price up here. I'm going to put PH for like high price, okay? But they didn't have to pay this high price. Instead of paying this high price, they got to pay this lower price. Now, there's also producer surplus. Producer surplus is this blue triangle that's created below the equilibrium price but above the supply curve. Once again, the idea here is that there are some suppliers who would have been selling for this price down here. I'll put PL for price low, but instead they get to sell at the higher equilibrium price. And so all the benefit that producers get from selling at the equilibrium price is right there. Hopefully that makes sense. If not, talk to me later. I'll try to explain it more. Now, this pink triangle that surrounds both triangles of consumer surplus and producer surplus is our total surplus. This is the benefit to all of society. So it's just the yellow area plus the blue area. Now, the good news is I'm never going to make you actually calculate this. Just the important thing is I want you to sort of know what they are. I want you to know where they are on the graph, and I want you to hopefully understand the basic intuition behind what they represent. So now that we know about producer and consumer surplus, let's see what happens to society's welfare if a price is set above equilibrium. When a price is above equilibrium, you can see that we're going to have a change to our producer and our consumer surplus. You'll notice that a high price reduces consumer surplus. Look how much smaller that little yellow triangle is compared to the triangle on the last slide. However, producer surplus is going to get bigger, and now it's no longer a triangle. It's sort of like a weird quadrilateral shape. Okay, but you might be saying to yourself, okay, well then this is great for producers, not great for consumers. Well, it's better for producers and it's worse for consumers, but it's actually bad for everybody because you'll notice that there's a great big old triangle that doesn't have blue or yellow in it. We're going to fill that up with gray because that's deadweight loss, meaning that that's benefit that's not going to go to either producers or consumers. And the reason why is because look how low our quantity demanded is whenever we set the price that high. That means that even though producers are going to produce this high quantity supply, they're not going to sell all of it. They're going to have a bunch of leftovers. They're going to have a surplus. That means producers are going to lose money because they will have wasted money producing stuff that nobody wants to buy, and they're going to be selling at a lower quantity. And so overall, even though they benefit a little bit, like this area here is their extra benefit from the higher price, they're going to lose because they're not going to sell as great of a quantity as they did before. So when the price is set above equilibrium and we have a surplus, deadweight loss is created. Now, because of that deadweight loss, producers have an incentive to reduce their price, and that brings us back to equilibrium, at least in a free market. Now, the opposite is true if we set a low price. Once again, we're going to have some deadweight loss happening here. Except this time, you'll see that consumer surplus is way, way bigger than it was before. Consumers have gained somewhat by the lower price. Producers, on the other hand, you can see that that blue triangle is a whole lot smaller now. Producer surplus has shrunk considerably, and it's because of this lower price. But keep in mind, guys, when that price is super low, our quantity supplied is going to be super low too. So that means that some customers are going to get a ton of benefit. I mean, holy cow, look at all this benefit here. But that only goes to the few customers who actually are able to buy this thing because it's going to sell out. So, if the price is set way too low, the product sells out. And even though it's cheaper, it's not widely available. So some people will benefit, but overall society doesn't benefit that much. And so once again, we've got this problem of deadweight loss. So when the equilibrium price is set below, or excuse me, when the market price is set below equilibrium and we have a shortage, Once again, we have deadweight loss, and so there's an incentive to change the price. The producers are going to raise the price because they want to take advantage of getting extra customers, and the only way that they're going to ever produce more is if they can increase the price that they sell the product for. So now that we know about deadweight loss and what happens when you don't let the market decide the price, you would say to yourself, well, why would anybody ever want to get in the way of the market deciding the price? I know it's crazy, but believe it or not, some politicians didn't pay attention in their economics classes. Guys, sometimes the government will intervene in the free market to try to limit the price of a good or a service. Now, they're doing this for the right reasons, but just because something feels good doesn't necessarily mean it's right. A price ceiling is what they call it, and it's the highest price that can be charged for a good or a service, and it's got to be set below equilibrium. This is really an important point. Price ceilings are always below equilibrium. This is almost always for products that are essential but too expensive for some customers. Think like housing in a city like New York. If you didn't know, New York is one of the most expensive places to live in the United States. Now, whenever the government dictates a maximum price, a price ceiling, it's always going to cause a shortage. You may remember that a shortage is a situation where quantity supplied is less than quantity demanded. They call this rent control. In New York City, there are laws that limit how high landlords can charge for low-income housing. And so, as a result, a lot of landlords don't want to provide low-income housing because they don't want to be limited in how much they can charge. So, even though there are really affordable apartments in New York City, there's just not very many of them. They're very hard to find. So even though the idea of a price ceiling is to make a product more affordable, it may not be widely available because the price is too low. So the idea here is that even though price ceilings are supposed to help people, in the end, price ceilings decrease total welfare and they increase deadweight loss. So this is what a price ceiling looks like on our graph. If we're talking about low-income housing in New York City, if we let the market clear, the equilibrium price would be EP and the equilibrium quantity would be EQ. But we have to set the price below equilibrium if we want to make this price ceiling effective. So this represents our price ceiling, PC. You can see that with the price ceiling, quantity supplied is less than quantity demanded. So what condition is created by a price ceiling? That's right, it's a shortage. So you can see it here on the graph. Price ceilings cause shortages. And just in case you forget, because I know you're thinking like, wow, that's confusing. The ceiling is down low. I'm used to thinking about the ceiling being up high. You can actually make a little house with your price ceiling. If I just connect this and connect this, we can put like some windows right here. Okay, look at that. Isn't that beautiful? We've made a little house. So if you can actually draw a little house on your graph, then you put your price ceiling in the right place. All right, now the opposite of a ceiling is a floor. So a price floor is when the government will intervene in the market to keep the price of a good or a service artificially high. And I know I'm not talking about tacos. I'm talking about things like minimum wage. So a price floor is the lowest price that can be charged for a good or a service. And once again, it's set by the government. This is for products that are usually prone to big price swings, or products where the government fears that producers may not be able to sell for their product for a high enough price. So the key with a price floor is that it must always be set above equilibrium. I know that's confusing because you think floors are low and ceilings are high, but it's the opposite on our graph. And once again, when you set the price above equilibrium, you're going to lead to disequilibrium. And that's going to cause a surplus where quantity supplied is far greater than quantity demanded. So one example here could be minimum wage. Minimum wage means that workers are supplying their labor, okay, and businesses are demanding their labor. So we have a supply and demand market. The thing is, though, that workers cannot freely negotiate for how much their labor costs. What's the lowest that a worker can charge for their labor? Well, in the United States, it's $7.25 an hour, or at least at the time when this video is being recorded. And so that means that there's a price floor in the market for labor. Okay. Now, price floors, once again, they decrease society's total welfare. So producers and consumers end up worse off. In the case of minimum wage, they might argue that businesses and workers are worse off because of minimum wage. And let me just really quick, throw a little asterisk in here. I'm not saying that I think minimum wage is bad. I think if minimum wage were increased too dramatically, like for example, if it went up like $30 an hour or something like that, that would actually be bad for the economy. Currently, right now, I think that minimum wage is actually a bit too low to be considered a serious price floor, and in many ways, it's ineffective. But if you want to know my views on minimum wage, holler at me sometime, and I'll be happy to explain. All right, so let's at least look in theory at what minimum wage does in the unskilled labor market. If minimum wage were set too high, so for example, like I said, if minimum wage were set way above the equilibrium price of an unskilled worker, like if it was $30 an hour or something like that, this would represent our price floor. The price floor is set above equilibrium, and it keeps the price artificially high. Now, whenever the price is artificially high, there's going to be a huge supply of whatever this thing is. In this case, the thing that we're talking about is labor. So there's going to be a lot of people who would love to go work at McDonald's if they could make 30 bucks an hour. But there won't be very many McDonald's who would demand that labor at such a high price. You're going to see a whole lot more of those self-service kiosks in McDonald's if they can't pay any less than $30 an hour to their employees. Okay? So the idea of a price floor is that the market price would like to fall down to equilibrium, but it can't fall to equilibrium because it runs into the floor. With the ceiling, which the ceiling would be down here, price ceiling, the price would like to rise up to equilibrium, but it can't because it runs into the ceiling. So both price ceilings and price floors keep the price away from equilibrium. So both price ceilings and price floors create disequilibrium. What kind of disequilibrium is created by a price floor? That's right, a surplus. All right, guys. Well, we've made it to the end of supply and demand. So hopefully all this made sense. If not, go back and watch the videos again, or of course you can always ask me. But here's a quick summary of what we've learned in this equilibrium lesson. Equilibrium is the point on the graph where supply and demand curves intersect. It's the price in the market where quantity supplied equals quantity demanded. And it's very important to remember that price is stable at equilibrium. In other words, there's no incentive for us to change the price once we're at equilibrium. Markets also move toward equilibrium. So if we're ever not at the equilibrium price, if we're at a disequilibrium, the market will naturally correct itself, and over time, because people respond to incentives, the market will move back to equilibrium. Disequilibrium is any price where quantity supplied is not equal to quantity demanded. So surplus, quantity supplied, is greater than quantity demanded, or a shortage, it's less than quantity demanded. Consumer surplus is the total benefit gained by consumers who buy things at the market price, and producer surplus is the total benefit gained by producers who sell things at the market price. And so our total surplus, or the welfare to society, is determined by producer surplus plus consumer surplus. Deadweight loss is the benefit that's lost to society when the market doesn't clear. In other words, when there's a price that's too high or a price that's too low, we're losing out on some benefit that we could have had from the market. And government price controls, like price ceilings and price floors, always result in deadweight loss. A price ceiling is the maximum price set by the government, and it must always be below the free market equilibrium price, and a price floor is the minimum price set by the government, and it must always be above the free market equilibrium price. All right, guys, that's it. If you have any questions, please reach out to me and let me know. Otherwise, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.